Hello, it's The Week in Art. I'm Ben Luke. This week, Inigo Philbrick and the allure of fraud in the art world, how a new law in Hong Kong might affect its art scene, and a sword belonging to a Sikh Maharaja. The convicted art fraudster Inigo Philbrick is out of prison and possibly seeking a return to art dealing. How is that possible? Tim Schneider, our acting art market editor, tells me about Philbrick's story, why the art trade is a natural habitat for fraud, and why a criminal past need not mean art world banishment. In the wake of the first Art Basel Hong Kong art fair to take place after the newly instated Article 23 security law, our associate digital editor Alexander Morrison talks to our correspondent in China, Lisa Movius, about the law's impact on artists, museums and others in the art world now and into the future. And this episode's Work of the Week is a sword associated with Ranjit Singh, the Maharaja, who's the subject of a major exhibition opening next week at the Wallace Collection in London. Davinder Toor, the co-curator of the show, tells me more. Before all that, a reminder that you can subscribe to the Art Newspaper at theartnewspaper.com and also to this podcast and our sister podcast, A Brush With, wherever you're listening. The latest episode of A Brush With features an in-depth conversation with Alex Katz. Please also give us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts. Now, the April issue of the magazine Vanity Fair features an extraordinary profile of the convicted art fraudster Inigo Philbrick, who was released from prison in January, as well as countless eye-popping and unself-aware quotes, including about the prison system, that there's so little that allows a man to feel successful or improve himself, and how he was struck since entering the Bureau of Prisons by how few of the people have even a conception of what an art dealer does. The article includes what appears to be a quite staggering statement that, even despite the fact that he owes more than $86 million in reparation to those he defrauded, he's considering returning to art dealing. But is it really that unthinkable? I spoke to Tim Schneider, our acting art market editor. Tim, we have talked about Inigo Philbrick on the podcast before, but can you remind us about that story, extraordinary story?
Sure, I'll do my best. Obviously, it's a complex story, but the gist of it is that Inigo Philbrick was this young rising star on the art dealing side of things who came up through White Cube, which of course is one of the most prominent commercial galleries in the world, was hugely successful there under the tutelage of Jay Jopling, eventually went out on his own, start his own dealership under his own name, and within a few years went from being this sort of ever-present wheeler dealer type at auctions and all these glitzy art world events to being hit with a series of civil lawsuits about complex financial deals that were not going through the way that they were supposed to for paintings that were often co-owned by certain parties. And eventually Philbrick fled the country, although in his telling, he kind of pushes back against that. But the facts of the case are that he had galleries in London and Miami. He shut those down, left the US, eventually was apprehended on an island in the South Pacific called Vanuatu. He was eventually accused of running a large-scale art fraud and eventually pled guilty to one count of wire fraud, I believe, and did about 4 years in prison on what was originally a 7-year sentence, and now is back out and in Vanity Fair and apparently ready to get back into dealing art.
That's why we're talking about this, to be clear. It's the extraordinary leap from being released from prison to a really prominent glossy magazine feature full of pouting faces and glamour, and it's like nothing ever happened. I think that's one of the things that makes me sit up and take notice the most. If it was just a feature on him, fair enough, there've been plenty of features on him, but it's just almost the chutzpah of the whole thing.
Yeah, well, you don't get to this stage without having a certain amount of bravado, I think it's safe to say, and the idea that prison would have dimmed that in any substantial way is maybe a little bit more wishful thinking from people on the outside who really want to believe that regulations and consequences can change people overnight.
Let's go into a little bit of the details, because actually one of the most important things about this piece is you do get Philbrick's side of the story in a way that we'd actually previously got this story mostly through things like court documents and so on. What does he say he did?
I think it's fair to summarize his position as essentially, listen, I acknowledge that I made some poor choices. I did some things I shouldn't have done, but it was always with the best intentions. I think that might be a direct quote. Mm-hmm. But it was always with this idea of kind of operating on the thin line between being a really successful, high stakes art dealer and having to take a certain amount of risk on when you do that, and stepping over the line and doing things that are actively fraudulent. And his position is basically, I know I ended up on the wrong side of that line. Eventually, I acknowledge that, but I never intended for that to be the case. I always wanted to pay everyone back. And listen, if a couple of these deals would have broken just a little bit different, I would have paid everyone back and we wouldn't even be in this position.
Yeah, exactly. And the thing is that the amount of money involved is still eye-watering. We're talking about $86,672,790 that he needs to pay back to all the people who he owes. And the key thing is there's still so much that's not sorted out in terms of ownership of artworks and so on. He's left a trail which is ongoing, right?
Yeah. It's difficult when you get into one of these types of scenarios to really know whether even the people involved in them at the very center know everything about what they've done. But there is one key figure in this entire saga named Robert Nuland, who is the only other person who has been accused of a crime and ultimately pled guilty to it. But Nuland was basically there to be Philbrick's financial advisor and to some extent I don't want to say the brains behind the operation, but he was really kind of the money guy. He was the spreadsheet guy. Like, he literally was in charge of keeping track of the spreadsheets that showed how much of each painting Philbrick had sold to which people. And like, I bring this up just because it demonstrates the fact that even people who eventually, for whatever reason, end up lapsing into fraud or perpetrating fraud or whatever, there's a certain kind of rigor that you need to be able to understand the web that you've created, I think. And it's difficult for people who are involved in it to know, and it's even harder for people who are coming into it from the outside and just trying to make sense of it to actually do so.
Right. And just to be clear, Tim, how widely before this did you understand that artworks were being part owned by people? Is it a very common practice in the art world? Is it very well known? Does everybody, oh yeah, so, that's one of those works which is half owned by so-and-so or a third owned by this person? Is it very common practice? Is it a rare practice but done, and so on?
It's pretty common if you're on the dealer side of things. It's not something that your average art enthusiast knows is happening. And that's because of the fact that it's something that has really ramped up as art and finance have gotten wedded together more and more tightly over the course of the past generation or so. Like, that's not to say that dealers in earlier eras weren't selling half of a painting to one person, half of a painting to another, and the parties involved treating that as an investment. But as time has moved on, I think the practice has become much more widespread, and the kinds of fractions of artworks that people are willing and able to buy into have really kind of winnowed down. And the ultimate example of this being, if you move into what I would consider like true fractional ownership, being these operations like Masterworks, which will parcel off a painting into hundreds of shares and sell it for $60 a pop, basically.
Right.
So that the average person out there on the street who wants to diversify their portfolio can own 1/350th of a Basquiat.
Right. Got you. Okay. Before we talk more about that, I wanted to dwell briefly on this idea that even while they're on the Pacific Island, Philbrick and his girlfriend, Victoria Baker Harbour, are conceiving of a docuseries treatment. They're literally, whilst hiding out, as it were, in the Pacific, conceiving of this as a media story, as something about which they want to tell the world, and they can see the kind of potential of it. Isn't the kind of glamour aspect actually, as well as being the thing that's enticing the press column inches and so on, something which is actually part of the mechanism of why this is so attractive, why fraud is so attractive actually within the art world?
Absolutely. I think that what you can see if you look at the history of media is that fraud is just, people love it. People love to read about it. They love these stories. And it's not hard to understand why. You have these people who are motivated by any number of different things, but they're essentially living a kind of dream that most people will never have any kind of real access to, and they're going to extreme dramatic lengths to try to carve out a space for themselves in this world, and eventually, often, usually, falling from grace to one extent or another. So it's like, from a dramatic standpoint, it's got basically everything that you want. It's these incredible rises and falls, the idea that somebody who's actually doing something wrong actually gets penalized in the end for doing it. Along the way, you have all these glamorous events and this big money and drugs and sex and art and all this. Like, of course people are wrapped up in this.
Exactly. And by all accounts, Hollywood producers are wrapped up in it, because there's talk in this Vanity Fair article of multiple producers getting in touch and wanting to buy this story and so on. And crucially, the fact is that Philbrick is talking about getting back out there. He's saying that he would like to be an art dealer again. And to me, I'm utterly speechless about this. Is this a plausible thing?
100%. I expect that he will be back and dealing, if he's not already, very soon, honestly.
So how is that possible, Tim? I mean, you've actually spoken to people who've done this, right? Convicted fraudsters who've got back out there and become art dealers again.
Yes. So I think that what's key to understand here is that it all comes down to the rarefied nature of the art business. I spoke to Ezra Chiki, who was a secondary market dealer in New York for 14 years before he was convicted of wire fraud in 2018. Now, Ezra did 13 months in prison, thereabouts, and was released in January of 2021. And in his telling, almost as soon as he was out, people were calling him and either offering him paintings or trying to partner with him on deals or whatever else. And he was a little surprised at the time, I think, but in looking back on it now is like, well, of course, yeah, because ultimately it's about access. Access is king in the art market, and there are only a very small number of people who really know things that matter, or who have, again, connections to people who own valuable paintings or whatever else. And so regardless of whether or not someone has done something criminal in their past or not, if you still think that they might be able to be a path to a major payday for you, there's a lot of people who are just like, well, sure, I'd rather deal with someone who hadn't been convicted, but how bad could it go?
Now, it's really interesting because Ezra Chiki, you had a discussion with him about the kind of fraudsters that exist in the art world. He defined himself as one kind. Tell me about the two types and where Inigo Philbrick fits in with this.
Right. So Chiki's stance, and I'm 100% on board with him here, is that you can largely split art fraudsters into two categories. One category is the people who, this is going to sound like we just talked about this because we did. It's basically Inigo's line now of, well, I was trying to behave honorably. I just got turned around on a couple of things, or one thing broke bad, and then I tried to cover it up with something else. And I just ended up getting over my skis. And the next thing I knew, I was really in way over my head. So that's one side of things. The people who claim that they never intended to defraud anyone, but then circumstances basically led them down that path. The second category is much more brazen. It's essentially people who set out from the very beginning to try to defraud someone. And there are certainly examples of this as well. There is most recently the case of Anna Delvey, whose real name is Anna Sorokin. She created this entire persona around herself that she was I can't remember if she was a European heiress or a Russian heiress, but one way or another, she was someone who was, in her telling, very well connected in the art world, was going to do all these things, got these people who were actually in the art world to, in one way or another, get involved with her. And lo and behold, the whole thing was a fiction from the start, and that was always the plan. There are other examples too. There's famously an artist named Wolfgang Beltracchi who now paints under his own name, but rose to a certain kind of notoriety and infamy by becoming really the world's best art forger. He was creating paintings for all of these old masters and selling them as if they were old masters. And again, like, that's not the kind of thing. You can't be like, well, actually, I was originally going to paint an original abstract composition. Then the next thing I know, I don't know, I got a phone call, and then I turned around, and what I had done instead was to create a Leonardo painting. I mean, it's like, it doesn't just
artificially aged Leonardo painting.
Right, exactly.
But the crucial thing is that you feel that the art world's particular parameters are a sort of healthy breeding ground for fraud to a degree. The particularities of art world transactions and the different nature of dealerships and so on mean that the kind of profit margins and so on create a kind of perfect storm for minor and then potentially eventually major fraud, right?
Right. So I think that if you were trying to construct an environment in which fraud could breed, like in a laboratory, you ultimately wouldn't be able to do better than like actually defining what the art world is. Like, this is just kind of the perfect example of a place where people can play fast and loose with the rules. The stakes are very high. The deals are largely informal in one sense or another, though they are becoming more formal. But essentially, there's a number of different ways we could go here. I'll say this. One, there's the access is king idea. Again, like, there are only a few people who really are connected to either other people or works of art that matter. And this is not talked about enough. And I say this as somebody who worked on the commercial gallery side for almost a decade. People don't talk enough about what deadbeats most collectors are in the end of the day. Like, it's the number of times that someone actually pays you on time when they've agreed to buy an artwork is so much lower than people on the outside actually expect. Like, buyers are routinely late with payments. And again, I do have some level of sympathy for dealers who will say, like, listen, I was put in really bad circumstances and I had to try to like figure something out on the fly, because that does happen all the time.
Yeah. The secondary market in particular obviously is one of the biggest issues, and that's where obviously the part ownership thing is really at its height. And of course, within the secondary market, because of the relative scarcity of works and so on, that amplifies those conditions even more, right? So such works of the highest quality and worth a lot of money are so rare that ultimately, again, that's a factor which adds into all of the intensity of the pressure on a deal.
Yes, 100%. It's important to keep in mind that art dealers on a year-to-year basis don't actually sell that many paintings. This isn't like you're selling computers or cars or something like that, where there's thousands and thousands and thousands of these things going out the door, let alone millions. I mean, you really only have a few deals every year, and within that small cohort, only a very, very few of those few deals really, really matters. So it puts you in a position where, again, you can kind of understand to some extent what could drive someone to say, man, I really don't want to do this, but if this deal falls apart, I am done. Therefore, I am going to edge up to the red line here, or maybe even step over it, with the intention, again, of like, well, once this passes, I'm not going to do this again. Everybody will be fine. Nobody knew that we kind of took it to this extreme. But lo and behold, these things just keep happening.
Right. Now, you said you reckon Inigo Philbrick's going to be out there, and probably is already. There's nothing stopping him, is there? Sam Bankman-Fried, the crypto king, very famous case recently, he can't do that again. He can't go back into financial services. There are regulations that will stop him. However, Inigo Philbrick can do what he wants within the art world.
Yeah, from a regulatory standpoint, yes, there is, again, art dealers are not licensed in any kind of way in the US, certainly. And so there's no grand authority that's going to prevent him from getting back into business if he wants to and if the clients are there. And again, there is a long history, especially in the US, of dealers who were either in prison or who got very close to being in prison, who had to settle civil lawsuits or whatever else. And at the time, we in the art press are sitting around going, man, this is really bad. Maybe this is the worst case of art fraud we've ever seen. And this person's life is over. And then lo and behold, you fast forward a few years and like, oh, that person's got a gallery on the Upper East Side. Or I just saw this person at an art fair. And not only were they, it's not like the rest of the people there were like shying away from them. It was like, oh, actually, they were there with a museum director. They were there with like a major collector, whatever. Oh, that's interesting. And it just keeps happening.
Right. And obviously, there are going to be people, unlike probably me, who will say, surely regulation is the answer, isn't it?
Well, I think that it would help, certainly. I kind of land in a, not surprisingly for people who know my work, like I land in a gray area on this issue to some extent, because I don't want to say that the art market shouldn't be better regulated. I think it should be better regulated, as long as it's done thoughtfully and with the input of the people who are actually in the business doing it. Like, I don't think it's going to be great if you just get a bunch of congressmen together in the US and be like, well, what should we do with art dealing? I don't know. Have you ever sold a painting? No? Oh, well, what the hell? Let's just figure it out anyway. But that said, like, I think that regulations can make things better, but they're never going to eliminate the appeal of this kind of thing and the sort of human nature aspect of it. I mean, the example that I always use here is look at the most regulated industries on earth. And we're talking about things like, to go back to Sam Bankman-Fried to some extent, finance or real estate or healthcare or any number of other things. And there's thousands of pages of legislation. There are dedicated agencies enforcing the regulations in these places. And yet, lo and behold, people are still being defrauded in all of them massively, like all the time. So the notion that all we need is a little bit better regulation or even a lot better regulation in the art market, and that's going to solve this problem, I regret to inform everyone, it's just never going to happen.
I think that's a good note to close this. Tim, thank you so much.
Always a pleasure.
You can read more on this story at theartnewspaper.com or on our app for iOS and Android. Coming up, Hong Kong's art scene in the shadow of a new security law and a Sikh Maharaja's sword. That's after this week's news bulletin. The American philosopher and gender studies scholar Judith Butler has pulled out of a series of events she had organised at the Centre Pompidou in Paris this month because of her position on the Israel-Hamas war. Butler, who is Jewish and a member of the US Association Jewish Voice for Peace, met with controversy due to her comments in a video-recorded lecture near Paris on the 3rd of March. She said that the 7th of October Hamas attack on Israel, although terrible, was not a terror attack or an anti-Semitic act, but an uprising and an act of armed resistance. She later clarified that she did not support or intend to glorify Hamas's atrocities. In a new statement, Butler said her presence in the Pompidou programme, for which she was the organisation's intellectual in residence, would be a distraction from the important work that will be presented by artists and intellectuals at the events, but that she had urged all the guests to take part as planned. Marlborough Gallery, one of the world's leading dealerships in post-war art, announced on Thursday that it will close its galleries in New York City, London, Madrid and Barcelona. The firm's art, assembled over decades and worth an estimated $250 million, will be sold off over the coming months and years, with a portion of sales going to non-profit institutions that support artists. From June, the gallery will no longer present exhibitions or represent artists and estates in the primary art market. Some staff will be made redundant, though a gallery spokesperson says some of the team will stay on to ensure that consignments are returned and the inventory is sold. Marlborough Gallery was founded in London in 1946 and represented many of the UK's most important post-war artists, including Francis Bacon, Lucian Freud and Barbara Hepworth. Its New York outpost worked with artists including Richard Diebenkorn and Clifford Still, as well as the estates of Franz Klein and Jackson Pollock, among others. A heritage group in Venice has criticised a public art project by the Spanish artist Manolo Valdés that has appeared in St Mark's Square. The project, entitled Las Meninas a San Marco, features 13 sculptures inspired by Diego Velázquez's celebrated 1656 painting Las Meninas and is overseen by the Venice-based Contini Art Gallery. The organisation, Italia Nostra Venezia, said in a statement that the sculptures had not been welcomed by many Venetians. It added that the project inflicted yet more violence on an already tortured body and was part of the biennialisation of Venice. The Contini Art Gallery said it had collaborated with the municipality of Venice and Vela SPA, a subsidiary company of the city. When the exhibition ends, one of Valdés's sculptures will be donated to Venice. The newspaper, Venezia Today, reported that the gallery paid €122,000 to Vela SPA to host the show. Contini Art Gallery declined to comment regarding the fee. You can read all these stories and much more on the website or the app. Now, last week's Art Basel in Hong Kong art fair took place just days after Article 23, a new security law, was passed in Hong Kong. The law has raised concerns over the tightening political climate. Fast-track legislation criminalising offences, including espionage and foreign interference, came into effect on the 23rd of March, expanding on the Beijing-imposed national security law passed in 2020 after pro-democracy protests. Statements by the US and UK governments, the European Union and the United Nations warn that the new law could further erode freedoms and stamp out dissent in Hong Kong. The EU also said that it could cast doubts on its long-term attractiveness as an international business hub. So what was the mood in Hong Kong, and what impact will Article 23 have on the art scene there now and in the coming years? Our associate digital editor, Alexander Morrison, spoke to our correspondent in China, Lisa Movius.
Lisa, we're fresh off a big week in Hong Kong with the city's Art Week playing host to a series of big events. The most significant among them, obviously, was Art Basel Hong Kong, which was back to its pre-pandemic size. How was it? What was the atmosphere like?
Well, Alex, I should first correct you there because they're calling it an art month now. They're very aggressively rebranding it as the Art March. And we're wondering, is it the Art March to where? It's very ambitious of them, and it was definitely ambitious in terms of the number of things happening in the city, both during Art Basel Week and presumably the whole of March, although I can't say I was there for the whole of it. Of course, Art Basel in Hong Kong was the main event, and everything else is centered around that happening. And as we reported, and as widely known, it was the first time it was back to the full two-floor, 240-some gallery size that it had in pre-pandemic times, so back in 2019. So just having the size back was already a big force of, momentum, at least, a certain kind of energy. That number of galleries definitely brought in a lot of people and a lot of events and a lot of promotion, as well as there being a lot of events organized locally within Hong Kong. So there was a big government conference that we went to. There were really big shows at M+ and Tai Kwun, the main institutions in Hong Kong, and then of course the galleries all pulled out the stops. So it was quite the lively week, to say the least.
Yeah, and I saw from your report with our colleague Gareth Harris, it seemed to be quite a positive, in terms of some big sales, lots of young collectors, a sense that people were buying across different mediums and categories. Mm-hmm. Was it kind of overall from a market perspective quite a positive event?
I wouldn't go so far as to say that. I would say that everyone went in with very measured expectations, and so people weren't too disappointed because it was pretty easy to do better than they anticipated. There were some very big sales, there were some outliers. I talked to a few small galleries who say they did very well, but I also talked to even more small galleries who said they only sold one or two pieces and did not recoup their costs. And you'll see in our report, though, of course, there's a handful of big sales. We had so many things that were in the $50,000 to $200,000 range selling, and far fewer of the million-plus pieces selling. So it's definitely not as much of a big money market. There is a lot more of effort being going into the middle range. The collectors still exist. People are still eager to buy art, but we don't have the mega collectors that we used to have coming through.
Arguably the biggest talking point, certainly in the background within the media, was Article 23, a new security law that came in about 10 days ago, and it tightens up a lot of rules that were already in place and puts some pretty heavy sentences in for things like espionage and treason. Could you just tell our listeners a bit about that law and what it's changed in terms of law in the city?
Right. So Article 23 was an amendment to Hong Kong's Basic Law, which is their constitution. That was initially introduced in the early 2000s, but there were massive protests around the city, the first wave of such massive protests that got the law tabled and was assumed to be for indefinitely. But since the protests were cracked down on and basically wiped out after 2020 with COVID, there is a mood that these things can be pushed through because there's not going to see the same level of resistance. The resistance was already pretty much wiped out with the national security law that got introduced from Beijing in 2020. And what Article 23 is a local law that kind of updates and fleshes out the national security law from Beijing. It doesn't radically change anything. It just adds an extra layer of the existing tightness.
And in terms of how it affects the art world, I noticed that Art Basel Hong Kong's director, Angel Yang Lee, in advance of the fair was playing down the idea, perhaps understandably, that it would affect the local art scene. I mean, what kind of censorship have we seen, if any, at the fair, for example, or even, in the early days of it being in place, this new law?
Well, Angel and the other ABHK staffers and Art Basel will always emphasize that they do not censor anything at the fair. Whether that's exactly true is hard to establish. Obviously, there's a lot of self-censorship that goes in because everything is pretty family-friendly, and while there are political works, there's nothing that's too explicitly critical of the Hong Kong or the mainland government. So I think what you see at the fair is not going to be radically changed because it has always been a little bit, I wouldn't say cautious, but aware of the context and also aware of the buyers and the visitors. So nothing that's going to anger people particularly. For the rest of the city, there's on one extreme saying that this is like a horrible thing, which, okay, fair. It's just like extremely bad. These measures are extremely repressive and that like Hong Kong is over. And then the other hand, you have the government saying and the government backers saying like, look, every country has national security laws and outlaws espionage. And, many countries have death sentences for these things. We just have like long prison terms, which, arguably is better.
It's big compared to the laws that were brought in the US after 9/11. Is that right?
Yes. And of course, national security laws that exist in many countries. So neither of those arguments are wrong, but the reality lies in two factors. One is the implementation, which we really do not know how aggressively this will be applied. So, for example, in mainland China, the laws are as strict, if not stricter, but they're applied in some areas, but they're very inconsistently applied. Whereas Hong Kong tends to enforce the letter of the law all the time, very aggressively. So you kind of have to worry about laws in Hong Kong a bit more than you do in the mainland because they're less loosey-goosey about things. And then the other thing in the middle is that it doesn't really change things that much on the ground because the national security law already established most of these things anyways. On top of that, the censorship is not, for the arts at least, it's not coming through these national security laws, it's coming through these bureaucratic nightmares of these extra rules you have to jump through for like fire and security. And the police are not going to come in and say, this work is bad, you have to take it down. They're going to come in and say, ooh, you need to like update your fire doors or this or that, the sort of obscure safety things. Or neighbors have complained about the noise is how they've gotten some small bookstores, and they might be able to do the same about galleries. So it's not necessarily going to come through the national security laws as through more other bureaucratic means if the government wants to do so. Also, a lot of the way censorship happens in Hong Kong is like through omission, not commission. So there's government funding, and then organizations like Jockey Club fund so much of the arts in Hong Kong. And if you are graylisted, like you're not in jail, you're not banned from travel, you don't know that you're actually in trouble, but maybe you've posted something on your Facebook that you've noticed, or, said something a little bit too loudly in the wrong company, and that has been, jotted down. You'll suddenly notice that you apply for funding and you just don't get it. You apply for projects and you don't get them. And you never know, is it because of the quality or is it because of, your political stances?
There are other factors at play as well in the background at the moment. There's been a lot of talk about economic troubles on the mainland, the property crisis, real estate crisis being a big one. Could you tell us a bit about that? How big a conversation point have they been in Hong Kong the last week or so?
At this point, the property issue is kind of like pollution. We just don't notice it anymore, right? It's been going on for several years. We know that it's bad. Companies are defaulting. Property prices seem to be going down and down. There's still a long way to go because the bubble was ongoing for, a decade or so. And property prices were very, very high compared to, cost of living in China and, Hong Kong as well. Well, Hong Kong, it's maybe a little more balanced because it's a very rich city. So I don't think the property market is as hit there as it is in Hong Kong as it is in the mainland. But overall, a lot of the affluent people in both China and Hong Kong have backgrounds in real estate, if not, part, if not into all of their portfolio comes from the real estate industry. And of course, in mainland China, property is like the preferred asset of choice, even for, just every individual, because there's so little else in means of investment. And especially because, property prices went up by like 10 times in the 90s and 2000s, that people have a lot of faith in it. So for the individual, like middle class or poor Chinese person, like they're seeing their generational wealth being wiped out by this crisis. So it's impacting everything in the economy here. And of course, the art market is certainly not immune from that.
It's not, but at the same time, it's interesting that there's so much discussion around Hong Kong declining in inverted commas when, China's just leapfrogged the UK to become the second biggest art market in the world again. Major museums have been opening in Hong Kong in particular, obviously M Plus in 2021 and the Palace Museum the year after. At the same time, there seems to be a lot happening in terms of international partnerships. The West Kowloon Cultural District holding its first international cultural summit during Art Basel Hong Kong, where it signed a kind of raft of new agreements with international institutions like the V&A and the Pompidou. It doesn't kind of scream decline or even kind of moderation. There seems to be quite a lot of ambition there. How does that measure up, do you think?
For all of its problems, I would say that Hong Kong is in some ways doing better than ever. And not just in terms of these like big spending, high profile projects coming from the government. 15, 20 years ago, there were very, very few well-known Hong Kong artists, or shall we say they existed, they operated, but they really couldn't find any kind of platform or visibility. Since Art Basel in Hong Kong has been such a huge success, certainly the focus and the market has been on, mainland artists and buyers, and then on like Western blue chip artists coming into, being traded. It's been a focus on the trade and as an art hub, not as an art center. But the local art scene really has expanded exponentially from, artists and curators and galleries, as well as the much more vaunted, of course, institutions. So, in terms of the grassroots aspect, which of course is, I think what is the hardest thing to build, there's a really interesting grassroots art scene in Hong Kong that, for all the issues of political repression and concerns about speech and emigration, is still stronger than it ever has been, or at least come in leaps and bounds in the last maybe 10 years. It's a difficult time, but it's still quite vibrant. And when it comes to the trading issue, you have to realize that Hong Kong has certain advantages that are unlikely to go away. So the proximity to mainland China with its huge market. And to circle back to the market thing, even during a downturn, China has a lot of people and it has a lot of rich people. And, as there's a natural progression of interest in the arts, there's always new people coming, new people who already have money but want to know, okay, where to spend, what to do with it, how do I invest? And whether it's as artistic, enthusiasts or investors in the art, there's always new people coming into the art market. And so that's going to give a certain drive even when the overall economic outlook is poor. So that's one advantage that Hong Kong will always have, because mainland Chinese collectors often don't speak English. Even if they do, there's not other places in Asia that are quite as friendly to them. There's amazing shipping and logistics in Hong Kong, and then there's a very low tax requirements. So it's a very, very friendly place for art business. So that's always going to keep driving it. The question is whether you're going to see good art shown and created in Hong Kong, or is it going to be a place for artotainment and safe shows in a box that are imported from European museums and then just, sales of pretty paintings as investment.
And I'm also aware that from a market perspective, major market names like the auction houses Christie's and Sotheby's are opening big outposts this year, supposedly. And going back to Article 23 for a moment, there's an interesting clause about companies potentially being banned from operating in Hong Kong should they be found to be working with foreign forces, in inverted commas. How might companies like Christie's and Sotheby's and the museums be affected by that? Is there any kind of clarity on what that kind of clause might mean?
There hasn't been any kind of clarity, but auction houses tend to be quite apolitical. And I think, if anything, they'll be even more apolitical going forward. There's definitely a huge safe space for them to stay out of any kind of political conversations that may happen and to just remain very neutral. I know the government is quite enthusiastic about the big presences of such companies in Hong Kong. And again, a lot of banks, a lot of big corporations have Asia headquarters in Hong Kong because of the tax and shipping considerations. So I don't think it's really a big issue for them.
Do you think that also applies to places like M+? I mean, I'm thinking about, there's been questions about homegrown museums like M+, not having the ability to be open and to be critical. Do you think that's going to make them even more insular, this idea of, not collaborating with international institutions?
I think they're going to be very careful about what institutions they collaborate with, and with an expectation that there are institutions that will not be particularly politically outspoken. There was a case a couple years ago where a mainland museum got in a lot of trouble because it had a show from a European museum that gave an award to a politically critical Chinese artist living abroad, I believe. But I think M+ is going to be super careful about, shall we say, vetting who it works with and making sure that no one gets embarrassed by anything. The problem for M+, I think, is not the collaborations that it does, but rather it'll be impacted by the brain drain issue, because not only are people leaving, people are reluctant to come to work in Hong Kong because they might have more strong political stances that they are not so willing to tamper down to stay out of trouble.
And just to dig into the brain drain for a moment, that's this idea that's been quite a lot talked about. It's also been referred to, I believe, as the Great Exodus.
Yes.
Which is, a lot of talent, including creative talent, making a kind of mass exit from Hong Kong. Mm-hmm. How much should we be reading into that? And also, where are artists going from Hong Kong?
Well, quite a few are heading your way because Hong Kongers are able to emigrate freely to the UK as former colonials. And so that's been very helpful as a place for people to go, although, I think it's very difficult to immigrate even when you don't have to worry about your visa. So there's a huge Hong Kong diaspora population, including many artists and curators who are starting to hold shows and be very active in the UK. Canada is also a big one because after the handover in 97 or leading up to it, quite a lot of Hong Kongers emigrated to Canada, and many people are dual nationals. And so people are back and forth, and Canada has the biggest population, I think, of Hong Kongers from that era. Not a lot, but some very visible Hong Kongers are going to Taiwan. But Taiwan is not exactly helpful with offering visas to Hong Kongers because it is afraid they will be spies. And there's a lot of prejudice in Taiwan against Hong Kongers as well as mainlanders. So they have options, but it all depends if you can afford to emigrate, and not everyone can. People have elderly parents or kids that they don't want to take out of school, whatever reasons that it's not possible or not feasible to immigrate unless things get a lot worse. I noticed, walking around, when people see each other at Art Week, if it had been a while, they're like, "Oh, you're still here. Oh, you're still here." It's the new greeting, how you doing? You're still here.
And what about those people that are still here? I mean, is there anyone in your mind that you might see as being particularly active or, I guess, in turn affected by some of the tightening of the laws? I mean, who should we be looking to as the kind of voices of the next few years?
I'm not going to name names because I don't want to point the government their way. But, far more people have stayed than have left. And they've just learned to be more careful. And, they say, often talking anonymously, but they say they feel it's really important to keep things going and to keep pushing back. One thing that gets lost in this discourse is that Hong Kong still has some of the freest speech in all of Asia, including more than most of the democracies. Remember that Singapore is not a real democracy. South Korea is a democracy, but it is still a very, very conservative Christian society. So In Hong Kong, you can see a lot of speech about feminism. You see a lot of very visible gay artist scene, and especially since the Sun Pride show a year ago, I think the queerness of Hong Kong art has become very visible and very celebrated. So, one show we reported on was the Xia Die show at Blind Spot Gallery, which is just very, explicit gay sex and male nudity depicted through paper cuts. And, they say they haven't had any problems. It's, it's maybe not too kid-friendly, but it's just very open. And, as long as you're not an institution, but even in the institutions, you can still do quite a bit. Taikun has a feminist show running right now that has some wonderful vulva posters. And coming from China, where everything has to be very hidden under layer and layer of meaning if you say anything at all, it's quite amazing to still see this kind of openness. And I think the people who are staying put in Hong Kong understand that if they all just give up and leave, then there's no one to keep things that open.
Well, thank you very much for chatting to me.
Always a pleasure, Alex.
And finally, it's time for the work of the week. The Wallace Collection in London next week opens the exhibition Ranjit Singh, Sikh Warrior King. It explores the life and legacy of Maharaja Ranjit Singh, who was born in 1780, died in 1839, and founded the Sikh Empire in the Punjab region in 1799. He ruled in Lahore and Amritsar until his death. As well as manuscript paintings, fine furniture, and exquisite jewellery from the Sikh Empire, the show includes a wealth of armour and weaponry, among them a sword that belonged to Ranjit Singh. I spoke about this glittering object with the show's co-curator, the scholar of Sikh art, Davinder Toor. Davinder, could you just begin by giving us a very brief intro to Sikhism in general?
So Sikhism, relatively young religion, one of the world's youngest religions. The founder of the faith, Guru Nanak, was born in 1469 in northwest India. And he was born at a time that kind of witnessed the early Mughal invasion of India.
And that's coming from Persia, right? So from Iran.
So Central Asian, the Timurid dynasty, descendants of Genghis. The Emperor Babur was the first great Mughal who came and conquered India. And Guru Nanak was there to witness this. And his message was a fairly simple one, really. He was challenging religious hypocrisy and challenging the class system, speaking to equality, and also just speaking to the oneness of humanity. So it was a very inclusive approach, and also challenging the idea of any religious labels, just talking to the Hindus and Muslims at the time, the populace of India who were coming into conflict, and just talking about their shared ideals that actually connected all of humanity. So that was his very simple message.
And is it right that in terms of proportion of the population, the number of Sikhs in South Asia at that time was relatively low compared to Hindus and Muslims?
Absolutely, yeah. It was, proportionally, far lower than it is now. And proportionally now, there are more Sikhs in Canada than there are in India.
Right.
And at that time, or certainly during the time of the Sikh rule of Ranjit Singh, for example, in the late 1700s, Sikhs made up about less than 10% of the population of Punjab.
Which is extraordinary given the achievements, which we're going to come on to. So you mentioned Ranjit Singh. He's the figure who effectively created the Sikh Empire. Is that too simplistic a way to put it?
He's the figure who is proclaimed the Maharaja, the great king of the Sikhs, at the age of 21 in 1801. And there are other Sikh kings and confederacy leaders in other parts of the region. However, Renjit Singh is the one that is considered the Raja who unifies through overpowering neighbouring kingdoms and kind of bringing these confederacies under one banner. So he's in the northwest part of the Punjab. There are other Sikh rulers who are below the Sutlej River, closer to where the English are, and they actually seek protection from the English from him. But he is considered the great first Sikh Maharaja.
Right. And within Sikhism, there's an important balance between language and poetry and so on and military paraphernalia and military activity, right? So that is a kind of very unified sort of kind of structure within Sikhism. Is that right?
Absolutely. I think it can come as a bit of a surprise sometimes, or certainly quite challenging when you look at how this warrior culture sits within this spiritual faith and is very much a very kind of important part of that faith. And that comes about, that evolves slowly. So Guru Nanak is the first guru born in 1469. The last of the 10 physical gurus is born in 1666. So there's 10 living gurus who kind of carry this message of Nanak, writing scriptures, poetry, the Sikh scriptures. The living guru of the Sikhs today is a collection of the writings of the previous gurus along with other Hindu and Muslim saints, and it's all set to music. So music is a very important part. In terms of the warrior tradition, that kind of comes about as the early Sikh gurus kind of gain popularity, and with that comes, the kind of power that goes with that, the following, they come into conflict with the Mughal Empire. And the fifth Sikh guru, who we associate with laying the foundation stone of the Golden Temple in Amritsar, he's executed under the orders of Emperor Jahangir. Just to put this into context, Jahangir is the father of Shah Jahan. Shah Jahan builds the Taj Mahal, or has the Taj Mahal built. So at that point, there's a change. And the Sikhs realise that they're not safe. And they, in order to kind of safeguard their spiritual traditions, they need to address how they're going to safeguard themselves physically in the real world so that they can protect themselves in the spiritual world. And that's when this martial culture starts to come about.
And they're so impressive, right? In the catalogue, you have all these wonderful quotes from people who are describing Sikh warriors and how impressive they are, both in terms of the way that they fight, but also in terms of the way that they are dressed, the way that they carry themselves in battle.
Absolutely. It's such an integral kind of part of the faith. The later gurus were warrior saints, and they lead from the front. And Ranjit Singh follows that example. Much of the respect that's given to him comes from the fact that at the age of 10, he's going with his father into battle. There's an account that says that his name, Renjit, means victor on the battlefield, is given to him because he's born on the battlefield.
Right.
So, he's given that respect because he is this warrior who's born into that culture, born on the saddle. He lives that life from day one. It's a completely in balance with that.
And it's one thing being a great warrior, but it's also important to be a great strategist, and it does seem like he's an extremely canny individual apart from anything else.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when you read about him, he's so enigmatic. He has an immensely attractive personality, and there's a French account from one of his ex-Napoleonic French general when he goes back to France. He writes it, and he says Renjit Singh has the power he knows how to make you love him. And I thought that was very powerful. And he commands this respect. And he also says, this French general, he says every 100 to 200 years, he said, someone is born, he said, who changes the destinies of men. And he is that force of nature. He's learning so much of it. He's had a difficult start in life. He's a bout of smallpox in his young age. He's blind in his left eye. His face is marked with smallpox by the age of 5. His father dies when he's 10. His father's only 25. And, his life is immediately at risk. He becomes the leader of a smaller Misl. Misl means the equal. It's the names that were given to these Sikh confederacies. There were 12 of them, a bit like the Scottish clans. And he becomes a leader of one of the smaller ones. So, he's a target. And through guile and charm and experience and fortune, he manages to navigate himself with the aid of his future mother-in-law, who is highly experienced and comes from another confederacy, to navigate himself as, and overpowering the other Sikh warrior leaders.
Right. And where does this sword that we're going to talk about fit in with all of that, if you like? At what stage in his rule is this sword a significant object?
This sword, which is one of the few objects associated with Renjit Singh in the UK outside of India, it's kind of like a pilgrimage object, I think, for many Sikhs, and not just Sikhs, but Punjabis. We spoke about how the Punjab was highly diverse. Most of Renjit Singh's Punjab is in modern-day Pakistan now. Mm-hmm. And this sword, which was most likely a gift of sort to him, it was made in Lucknow in the state of Awadh. It has this highly prized Persian watered steel blade. You can see the kind of the waves and the watering.
We've got an amazing close-up right in front of us. It's such a beautiful metal.
Absolutely.
It's like it's painted or something. It's just got this extraordinary delicacy to it.
Yeah, it's made using high carbon and low carbon steel, and then acids are applied to bring out the contrast. It has an aesthetic quality, but also a functional quality. These high and low carbon steels allow the blade to be sharp, but also to retain some flexibility. And these blades were worth their weight in gold at the time. There are accounts of Renjit Singh paying £1,000 then just for a blade.
Wow.
Which I think equates to about 80 to £100,000 now. The mounts are solid gold, and you see these anamorphic details on various parts of this sword, which is actually called a shamshir. It's a curved saber, and you see these kind of blue bulls or nilgais, these antelopes on the pommel of the sword and on the quillons. And at the centre of the crossguard, you see this emblem of this tiger. Mm-hmm. Singh can translate to lion and to tiger. So Renjit Singh is the tiger who is victorious on the battlefield.
Right.
So it's quite emblematic. The grips are made of walrus ivory, and it's studded with little seed pearls and gems on the scabbard, which is embroidered with this threadwork and tooled leather gilt design.
How would it have been used in its time? So he's got this sword. What does he do with it?
Well, a common question sometimes is that often you find very decorative objects, and we kind of imagine immediately that surely they weren't used. They're too decorative, too expensive. And there's some truth in that, in the sense that something like this was most likely what we would call a durbar piece, something that was meant to be worn like you might wear a fashionable wristwatch or something. This was jewellery of its day. Everybody would carry a sword. At the same time, it's completely functional. So also we have accounts of warriors, and you'll see examples of armours in the exhibition that were made for use that are highly decorative. And the Sikhs some of these warriors had immense wealth, and these were custom-made weapons. It's possible that given all the animals that are depicted on this sword, particularly on the chait, there's a series of animals that would have been, you'd be familiar with associating with the hunt. So perhaps it was a sabre that he might have taken with him when he was out hunting, for example.
Right. So that's really interesting, because the hunting was, of course, part of the whole courtly ceremony that would have been a part of that whole extraordinary culture around that court, right? Because it was, despite the fact that it sounds like he was quite modest in his own dress, for instance, there was still a level of opulence, both in Amritsar and in Lahore, that was extraordinary and captured in all sorts of fine paintings and so on.
Absolutely. It's part of the charm of the Maharaja Ranjit Singh is his complex character. He has these humble beginnings. He's a worker. He's a grafter. They say that he doesn't like to have massages. He doesn't particularly, like other Rajas, he doesn't get his feet massaged, his back massaged. They say that he doesn't, the French say of him that he doesn't know how to dine well. Like he'll often just sit on the floor and dine wherever he can, and he's chased around by his fat cook who's always trying to get him to eat. And Ranjit Singh, what makes him accessible to us, to myself as a common person, is because he has that modest nature. There's one of his Muslim ministers, his foreign minister, says of Ranjit Singh that he's himself is quite simply dressed. He doesn't wear very many jewels. He dresses his courtiers and his warriors very, very well, and because of that, he shines bright. Right. At the centre of that, and that kind of just paints that picture.
But is dressing in that way a kind of strategic idea? As in, if I dress modestly, people will take me seriously as a man, as a spiritual person, as well as a warrior and so on, and as a prince, as it were. So, he's covering lots of bases by adopting that position, if you like.
Absolutely. I think we need to give Ranjit Singh a lot of credit for all the things that he doesn't say, but the things that he does and how he lives. Part of that, I think, is the fact that it's his innate nature. It is not to say that he doesn't enjoy life. It's just to say that actually he loves working, hunting, riding, training and seeing his troops. But at the same time, he also knows and understands the people that he rules over. So in order to make himself likeable, trustable, like he's a man of the people. In fact, there's a painting in the exhibition, very fine painting that we borrowed from the Musée Guimet, which has these 4 couplets in Persian in its corners, and one of them says that there's no distinction between Ranjit Singh. He's like the common man and he's like the king. And for that to be on this very fine painting, that's just portrait that's painted not long after his death, it speaks to his character.
That's really interesting. Tell us where this sword fits in terms of the level of finery of other objects in the court. How much of a standout object is it in a way, or is it just typical of the kind of incredible finery that would have been on view elsewhere?
It's pretty typical. It's an extremely fine and quite a unique object. This is a sword that we would associate with the ruling class of its time. It's got the Damascus steel, the solid gold mounts, fine Persian mortared blade, which is probably far earlier than the mounts, and it's gem set. So it is an example of what we would see in the exhibition and ties in with Sikh splendour of the day.
So tell us what happens to this sword after the death of Ranjit Singh, because actually the Sikh Empire falls apart quite quickly after his death, right? So within years, there are wars which effectively bring an end to the empire.
Absolutely. I mean, Renjit Singh, he's proclaimed Maharaja in 1801. So his rule lasts about 40 to 50 years. And that's a really long time, given the history of Punjab. In particular, it's the gateway, to Delhi. It's the invasion route into India. And in the 1700s, it's seen 8 or 9 invasions by Afghan kings. And, when the Mughal treasury is plundered a number of times. And so it's an extraordinary long amount of time that he ruled over. And in that time, he brings this peace and tranquility to Punjab. But as you say, pretty much soon after his death, within 10 years, the kingdom collapses. And there is a succession plan to some degree, but there are so many characters, so many traitors and villains, people looking for self-preservation, and the empire collapses. At the end of 1849, in the early 1850s, the Sikh treasury, which by this time the Punjab is annexed to the East India Company, and the Sikh treasury at Lahore is broken up. It's been an expensive 6 battles, 2 wars for the British, and they need to recoup some costs. Some of the key objects from the treasury that belong to Ranjit Singh, who himself is a collector, either go to Queen Victoria, and then now can be seen in the Royal Collections. 1 or 2 of those objects are here in this exhibition, or went to the then India Museum, now the V&A. And many others are sold in a series of about 10 auctions that take place in Lahore. And Maharajas and nobles come from all over India to buy these treasures, these jewels and various objects. And that's when we see probably the first time that these works such as this sword are probably entering the market here in Europe. So they're either being sold and bought and taken out, and that's when they come. So we know that this sword, when we trace its history, is acquired by the 4th Marquis of Hertford not that long after that period. So it's exhibited in Paris in 1865 alongside many other Sikh objects from the Wallace Collection. And this exhibition really kind of looks at some of those objects, which ordinarily, you see them in an arms and armour gallery, you look at them as just objects of arms and armour and, view it as a sword, but they are windows really to the past, to an immense amount of shared Anglo-European Sikh Punjabi heritage, and take us back, and we're able to look at these personalities and characters such as Renjit Singh or his courtiers or his wives or his children, and kind of examine how we've got to where we are now. Because had the Sikhs not lost Punjab in 1849, it's quite possible that the British could have been expelled from India 100 years before they actually did. The Punjab was a buffer state, and it was one of the last states to be conquered by the East India Company, and there was a battle where the British were on the verge of unconditional surrender.
Wow.
So the actual history of the world could have changed at that point if it wasn't for various reasons. But,
absolutely. But Ranjit Singh was instrumental in keeping that peace because somehow he was able to both manage the Afghans from the north and also the East India Company, pre the British Raj, from the south. So he's got an extraordinary adeptitude for keeping a kind of peace. And then it sounds like even going further than that.
Yeah, and this is where I think, he's a visionary. He can see ahead, and don't get me wrong, in his early 20s, he had this insatiable appetite. He wants to extend. He's extremely hungry. He's pushing all the boundaries. He wants to know the limits of where he can take things to. And, the accounts of the time talk about how you can't talk sense to him. He's extremely stubborn, but he knows what he needs to do. And at the same time, when he has this diplomatic relationship kind of developing with the British, he gets to observe, he gets to learn. He knows that he's not ready at that point to engage with them, so he doesn't want to do that. So he signs this Treaty of Perpetual Friendship in his 20s with the British. So he is pushing against the Afghans. He expands the kingdom as much as he possibly could. He doesn't always get what he wants, but he doesn't engage the British. And, they are friendly with one another. And there's an English account at the time which says that the folly of the Sikhs after his death is the fact that they did engage the British, who, despite having this cordial relationship with Ranjit Singh, still had 39,000 troops stationed permanently on the border. So it's a bit of a standoff, but they understand that he is this buffer state. There's this perceived threat that the French and the Russians who've signed this treaty with one another are going to ally and come and invade India. It's an imagined threat. It doesn't obviously come about. And Ranjit Singh's happy to play along with that.
Davinder, it's an extraordinary story and an extraordinary object, so thank you very much for telling us about it.
Thank you very much.
Ranjit Singh, Sikh Warrior King, is at the Wallace Collection in London from the 10th of April to the 20th of October. And that's it for this episode. You can find us on X, formerly known as Twitter, at Tan Audio, and on Facebook, Instagram, and Threads. The Week in Art is produced by Julia Mahauska, Alexander Morrison, and David Clack, and David's also the editor and sound designer. Thanks also to Daniela Hathaway and to our guests, Tim, Alex and Lisa, and Davinder. Thank you for listening. We'll see you next week. Bye for now.